Well, President Ford had several sources for his imagination that if you look at all of his work as president, you'll see that there were several things that he did quite well. First of all, he had a real sense of the short-term needs of our country. When he became president on August 9th, 1974, he knew that he had to begin a healing process because the country had been damaged by President Johnson and his lying to Congress about the Gulf of Tonkin. There was no second Gulf of Tonkin attack. Essentially, LBJ had lied to Congress and the American people so that it would be easier to commit troops in Vietnam. And whether you support the Vietnam War or not from this perspective, I'm just talking about the damage to the institution of the presidency. Then, of course, Nixon comes along, and he had Watergate, and of course, it was never proven that Nixon had direct knowledge of the break-in before it happened. But of course, what Nixon got in trouble for, and where it was proven, was that he tried to cover up whatever knowledge he had. So and you know this, you lived through this period. I mean, I was in high school, but you were adults in that period. And you know what happened. The country lost its confidence in the institution of the presidency. We had so many problems. We had the race riots in the cities. We had a nuclear policy in our foreign policy called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. We had a Vietnam War that was grinding this country's public discussions to a halt, where buildings were burned on college campuses, where Kent State was happening. I mean, so much trouble. I mean, young people today don't have a clue what it was like to live in the revolutionary time of the late 60s and the early 70s. The environmental movement was getting started because the first long gas lines were starting up with the first energy crisis, when OPEC engineered a crisis and prices went up, and the United States got a taste of what it would be like to live in a society that might not have enough energy to support our civilization. You take out energy from a civilization, you ruin that civilization. And it was skillful negotiating which brought everybody back from the ledge. But that was the atmosphere of mistrust, of a lack of confidence. President Carter would later call it, in the late 1970s, a sense of malaise. And of course, the American people turned on him for saying that. The American people were not yet ready to accept defeat. But this was the environment in which President Ford comes into the office with a sense of a really beaten down people. And so he determined that the most important thing was to overcome what he called our long national nightmare. Overcome that nightmare and start the process of healing that would be so important. And where does that start? Right with himself. He knew that it was essential to start the healing process by his own integrity. People had to trust him. You know, when I was with him in 2005, in the series of interviews that I just referenced, when I went to see him in Vail and camped out for a month with my son back there, I asked him in one of our visits, I said, Mr. President, what is the most important quality a leader must have? And we had talked about vision and that kind of thing. And without skipping a beat, he said, trust. The other leaders must be able to trust what I say. I will not lie to them. The people need to trust what I'm saying. When I go down to the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, actually up to Capitol Hill, the people with whom I negotiate have to trust that what I say is my bond. My word is as good as can be. Foreign leaders need to be able to trust what I'm about. How can we negotiate any treaty if my word means nothing to them? I'm not going to be like Joseph Stalin and break my word when it comes to treaties. So he thought that it was absolutely essential to begin that healing process, starting with himself by demonstrating to the American people he would be a different kind of leader compared to LBJ and Richard Nixon, which is what, of course, the Americans had gotten used to beforehand and had turned off and tuned out politics. So this idea that our long national nightmare would be over, that was the short-term vision. But he had a long-term vision too, because remember, this is 1976. What happened in 1976? That was our what? Our celebration of our 200th birthday as a country. So Ford was constantly giving speeches and hearing people come to the White House, guests coming to the White House who were talking about the founding generation, the men and women who actually set up a system of government that would endure after that difficult period of independence. So the framers of the Constitution, and then the brave men and women who had been part of the independence. And you have to include the women like Mercy Otis Warren and people like Abigail Adams as well. Just all kinds of heroes during that period. And President Ford was steeped in his exposure to the founding generation. And as a result of that, I think he, even though he had been in Congress for 13 consecutive terms, he was just imbibing patriotism all the time because of it's our national capital. You can't walk 2 or 3 blocks without this hitting you right between the eyes. But because it was 1976, it was particularly an important time, and he was just filled in his imagination with the greatness of this country, the potential of this country, the struggles of this country. He had lived through a critical time. You know, his childhood was spent in Grand Rapids in the Depression. He knew what economic depravity was. He knew what World War was. You know, Winston Churchill said that World Wars II and I could actually be seen in a continuum as our great 30 years war of the 20th century. So he knew a long period of war. And then he comes off the USS Monterey and he comes back into civilian life into a Cold War. And then he begins serving after his election, first election in 1948. And he'll serve for 13 terms, or be elected for 13 terms in Congress. So he has a sense of the terrible crises of the 20th century. We forget today, and when I teach young people in the classroom, now in the post-Cold War world, young people today don't understand what the Cold War was like in the same way that I don't understand, as well as my dad does, who fought in the Pacific Theater, what World War II was like, what it was like to fight a military dictatorship, Tojo, in Japan. But I try to emphasize to students, think of what your grandparents went through. It'd be about that age. A Great Depression, the greatest economic depression the world had ever seen. World wars that killed 60 million people. It's unfathomable. The worst wars in human history, the greatest threats to our freedom and our institutions in human history. The rise of ideologies like communism, Nazism, more vicious than anything that had been seen before not because human nature got more evil at this time, not at all, but because the people who wanted to be dictators had such powerful technology in their hands, they could visit tremendous destruction. And the Black Book of Communism says that over the course of the 20th century, 100 million people were killed by communists. I'm going to repeat that. 100 million people killed by communists in the 20th century. This was the world that is shaping up around Ford. So his vision, his imagination, is of America that in 1776 had a promise for freedom and ordered liberty, not just the kind of libertine, sort of do whatever you want, do your own thing kind of liberty, but truly an ordered liberty, ordered by internal discipline, by your moral compass, and an external social order. All of this was important to Ford because he saw the promise of this country in contrast to the threats to a decent possibility for life that we saw in the 20th century through Nazism and communism and so forth. So he has a short-term vision to heal the country, starting with himself as the president and establishing trust in the institution of the presidency so that people would appreciate the government again of the freest country, the most consequential country that's ever existed in terms of liberty. And then the long-term vision of what it meant to be heir to the generation that founded this country.